Adaize Okafor was 38 years old, and for 10 years she had let her husband believe she was one emergency away from financial ruin. To look at her, the picture held. She drove a 12-year-old Honda that she maintained herself with the diligence of someone who could not afford to replace it. She shopped at discount grocers and clipped coupons from the weekend circular, and kept a modest checking account that her husband, Curtis Okafor, monitored the way certain men monitor things they believe belong to them. She wore sensible shoes and carried a canvas tote, and took the bus to her second job, or what Curtis believed was her second job, 3 evenings a week. His friends called her practical. His mother had once described her, not unkindly, as the kind of woman who knew how to stretch a dollar. She had let all of it stand. She had never corrected any of it. When the marriage began to collapse, it collapsed from the inside the way a building does when the structural decisions were wrong from the start. Curtis had been spending money that wasn't his to spend on a woman named Tanya Reeves, a property manager with a leased luxury apartment in the Midtown district of Atlanta, and the particular ease of someone who had never been told no. By the time Adaize understood the full shape of it, Curtis had already told Tanya she could move in. He had told her the apartment would be available because his wife was broke and couldn't fight him for it, and that the place was practically his already. The apartment he had promised Tanya was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building on Peachtree Circle that Curtis believed was owned by a property management corporation and rented month to month. The building had 14 units. Adaize's holding company owned all 14 of them, and the property management corporation was hers. She had let him move out. She had watched him take his things. She had said nothing. What happened next took 60 days and cost Curtis Okafor everything he had ever assumed was secure. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening light came through the kitchen window of Adaize's house on the south side of Atlanta in a long amber band that crossed the counter where she was standing, running a bead of caulk along the backsplash she had retiled herself the previous spring. She worked with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who had done this kind of labor before, pressing the caulk gun at a consistent angle, smoothing each joint with her thumb, stepping back every few feet to check the line. The tile was a deep terracotta she had chosen from a salvage warehouse on the east side of the city, mismatched in the way that certain things are mismatched when they are assembled over time rather than purchased at once, and she had laid every piece herself on a long weekend in April, while Curtis was away at what he said was a conference in Birmingham. She was a civil engineer. She had been one for 15 years. Working first for a municipal infrastructure firm and then, for the last 8 years, building a private consulting practice that focused on structural assessments and renovation planning for residential and small commercial properties. The practice was profitable and discreet, and she had never once mentioned its full scope to her husband, not because she was hiding it from him, but because he had never asked questions specific enough to require a full answer. She had learned this from her father. Not deception. Her father had not been a deceptive man. What he had taught her, without intending to, was the difference between volunteering information and withholding it. Her father, Samuel Adaize, had been a quiet electrician in Stone Mountain for 30 years, who had owned 3 rental properties by the time he died, and who had told no one outside the family. Not because he was ashamed, but because he understood, with the practical wisdom of a man who had watched what happened when people knew what you had, that some things were better held close. He had said, in the last year of his life, sitting in the kitchen of the house she now owned, Adaize, the man who shows you everything in his hands at the beginning of the game has nothing left to show you when the game gets hard. She had written it on the inside cover of her engineering notebook. She had looked at it often. She had met Curtis at a community development meeting in her third year of private practice, a session convened to discuss the infrastructure implications of a proposed residential expansion on the west side of Atlanta. He was a mid-level project coordinator for a development company, handsome and confident in the way of someone who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in a room. He had made an error in his presentation regarding soil load tolerances, and she had corrected him quietly, without embarrassment, and he had taken the correction without defensiveness, which she had found notable. They had coffee after the meeting and dinner the following week, and in those early months he had been attentive and curious and genuinely interested in her work, which had made the version of him that emerged later all the more legible as a performance that had simply run its course. They had married in the fourth year of her practice. She had purchased the Peachtree Circle building the following year, through the holding company she had established in her mother's maiden name. She had said nothing about it to Curtis because the holding company predated the marriage and was structured entirely in her own name and therefore required no discussion, and also because she had simply not felt moved to mention it, which she recognized later as her father's instinct working through her hands before she had fully understood it. The building had 14 units. She managed them through the property management subsidiary, the way she managed everything, systematically, without drama, with her name appearing nowhere on any communication that a tenant would encounter. The leases were clean. The maintenance was prompt. The building ran the way a well-built structure was supposed to run, quietly, and without requiring attention that it had not already anticipated. Curtis had rented the fourth-floor apartment in the third year of their marriage, telling her he needed a space close to a project site on the north side of the city. She had processed the rental application herself through the management subsidiary and had approved it because the application was sound and because she had always kept the building separate from the marriage and saw no reason to change that simply because the applicant shared her last name. She had told no one. The property management company's name appeared on the lease. Her name did not. That arrangement had held for 7 years, right up until the moment Curtis told Tanya Reeves she could move into Unit 412. The incoming signal had been, characteristically, not dramatic. It was a voicemail, left by Tanya Reeves herself for the property management line, asking to confirm move-in procedures for the fourth-floor apartment. The voicemail referenced Curtis by name and described herself as his partner, who would be taking over the unit beginning the first of the month. The caller's tone was the tone of a woman who had been told the path was clear and was simply managing the logistics. Daisy listened to the voicemail twice. Then she set her phone down on the engineering notebook and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Her hands did not shake. She opened the tenant file for Unit 412 and reviewed it with the same systematic attention she brought to a structural assessment report. The lease was in Curtis's name. The unit had been in continuous occupancy for 7 years. There was no provision for subletting or for adding an occupant without written approval from the management company. There was also a clause, standard in all 14 of her leases, that listed unauthorized transfer of occupancy as grounds for termination of the tenancy agreement. She had drafted that clause herself. She pulled the financial records next. Her engineering practice kept separate ledgers, but she maintained a combined personal financial summary that she updated quarterly, and she pulled the most recent version and reviewed it with care. Curtis had been contributing to their joint household account for 8 years, and she had been depositing equal amounts into the same account, and she had been paying all of the actual household expenses from a separate account he did not know existed, which meant the joint account had been accumulating for 8 years without either of them drawing from it in any meaningful way. The balance was $214,000. That was his money, and hers in equal measure, sitting untouched, which meant his understanding of their shared financial picture was based entirely on the modest checking account he monitored, and the salary deposits she made into the joint account and withdrew from her own funds simultaneously. He had, for 10 years, believed he was watching her financial life. He had been watching a stage set. She went further. She pulled his bank records through the access she retained from a joint account they had opened during a car purchase 6 years prior, and which Curtis had stopped using, but never closed. The records showed transfers she had not been told about. A pattern of withdrawals over 22 months directed to an account she traced through the routing number to a second account held in Tanya Reeves's name. The total was $47,000. He had not only been conducting the relationship, he had been furnishing it with money that was partly hers. She photographed every statement. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She opened a folder on her laptop and named it, with the precision of a structural engineer who had spent her career labeling exactly what something was. Unit 4112. She made one call. She said, "Brenda, I need you. This week." Every building has a load-bearing wall. The question is always whether you're the one who built it, or the one who just found out it exists. Brenda Asante's office was on the second floor of a converted row house in Inman Park that she had occupied for 19 years, and it had the organized density of a workspace belonging to someone who handled a large number of complex situations simultaneously and had developed systems for each one. She was a family law attorney with a subspecialty in property and asset disputes, which was exactly the combination the situation required. And she had known Adeze for 6 years through a professional network associated with Atlanta's engineering and development community. She reviewed the Unit 412 folder, the bank statements, the transfer records, and the lease documentation across her desk on a Wednesday afternoon without expressing anything beyond measured attention. When she finished, she set her reading glasses down and said, "He told his girlfriend she could move into a building that you own, using a lease that he is currently in material breach of, while moving money from shared accounts into her name. Those are 3 separate legal problems layered on top of each other." Adeze said, "I know." Brenda said, "His attorney is going to be in an interesting position." Adeze said he doesn't have an attorney yet. Brenda looked at her for a moment. Then she said, simply, "Good." They spent 90 minutes mapping the strategy. Brenda would file the divorce petition and asset disclosure simultaneously, ensuring that Adeze's holding company portfolio, the engineering practice, and the joint account balance all entered the proceedings on the record before Curtis had time to consult anyone about their existence. The unauthorized occupancy issue at Unit 412 would be handled through a notice of lease violation and notice of termination, issued through the property management subsidiary to the tenant of record, which was Curtis, for unauthorized subletting and transfer of occupancy without written consent. The notice would arrive before Tanya Reeves moved a single box into the building. Adeze's father's oldest friend, a retired contractor named Hezekiah Price, who had known her since she was 7 years old, and who had helped her assess the Peachtree Circle building before she purchased it, called her on Thursday evening after she had left Brenda's office. He had heard from her mother that things were in motion. He said, without preamble, "You doing all right?" She said, "I am." He said, "Your father would have had something to say about a man who moved into a house he didn't build and thought he owned it." She said, "He would have said it very quietly." Hezekiah laughed and said, "He would have. That's how he always said the most important things." A pause. "You build what you build, Adeze. You don't have to explain it to anyone who wasn't paying attention." She thanked him. She sat for a moment after the call in the quiet of the house she had paid for herself, and thought about her father's hands and his 3 properties, and his long, careful silence about the things that mattered most. Then she went back to the engineering notebook on her desk and opened it to a fresh page and began sketching the timeline for what came next. Because she had always found that laying out a plan the way she laid out a structural drawing, step by step, load by load, with every joint accounted for, was the surest way to know whether what she was building would hold. By Friday morning, Brenda had filed. By Friday afternoon, the notice of lease violation had been delivered to Curtis's address on file with the management subsidiary, which was the Peachtree Circle apartment itself, which meant he had received a formal notice that he was in material breach of his lease for unauthorized subletting at the same time he received, from a separate courier, the divorce petition and the initial asset disclosure. The asset disclosure listed the holding company. It listed all 14 units. It listed the engineering practice. It listed the joint account balance. It listed his $47,000 in unauthorized transfers, sourced and documented. It listed the total assessed value of Adaisy's separately held real property at $3 million. Curtis had believed he was leaving a broke woman. He had left the majority owner of the building he was living in. On Saturday evening, 2 days after the filings, Adaisy went home and made pepper soup with the patience the dish required, standing at the stove for an hour and a half and adding each spice at the right interval and tasting it twice before she was satisfied. It was a recipe her mother had given her, and that she made when she needed her hands occupied and her mind free to work undisturbed. The house was quiet. The caulk line along the backsplash was clean and even. The tile she had salvaged and laid herself caught the kitchen light the way she had expected it would when she chose it, warm and unhurried. She was not angry. She had not been angry since the voicemail. What she had been was clear, and clear was a more useful condition than angry in every circumstance she had ever encountered. He was performing for an audience that had already reviewed the foundation report and knew the building wasn't his. The mediation was held at Brenda's office on a Tuesday morning in November, 8 weeks after the filings. Curtis arrived with an attorney he had hired the previous week, a competent man who had nonetheless had only 5 days with the material, and whose expression in the first 5 minutes of the session suggested he was still working to reconcile what his client had told him with what the documents said. Curtis had not told his attorney about the holding company. He had not known about it himself. Brenda placed the asset disclosure on the table first, the holding company portfolio, the 14-unit building, the property management subsidiary, the engineering practice revenue, the $3 million valuation, the joint account balance of $214,000 accumulated over 8 years of parallel deposits he had never tracked because he had believed he was tracking her only account. She placed the bank transfer records beside it. 22 months, $47,000, Tanya Reeves's account number on the receiving end of every transfer. She placed the lease termination notice last. Curtis Okafor, tenant of record, Unit 412, Peachtree Circle. Material breach confirmed. Tenancy terminated. 30-day vacate notice enclosed. Curtis looked at the termination notice for a long time. His attorney leaned in. He read. He wrote a brief note and pushed it across to Curtis, who read it and set it down and looked at Adaisy across the table with the expression of a man who had walked into a room he believed he had mapped and found entirely different walls. He said, "You own the building." She said, "I have owned it for 9 years." He said, "You never told me." She said, "You never asked." The room held that for a moment. He said, his voice shifting into a register that was almost conciliatory, "Adaisy, I think there's a version of this where we both walk away without making it worse than it has to be." Brenda said, before Adaisy could respond, The version where it doesn't get worse requires your client to acknowledge the transfer records and sign the settlement today. The version where it gets worse involves those transfer records going to a forensic accountant and a determination about whether they constitute dissipation of marital assets under Georgia law. Your client should choose carefully. Curtis's attorney conferred with him in a low voice for 3 minutes. Then he nodded. Curtis looked at Adize one final time. He had the look of a man who had just understood, fully and finally, the precise distance between what he had thought he knew and what was true. She looked back at him with the steady, unhurried attention of a structural engineer reviewing a report she had already written. There was nothing left in this room that she needed to read. She said, "The building is mine. The practice is mine. The joint account will be split evenly, which is what it was always going to be. The transfers will be repaid with interest, as the settlement specifies. You have 30 days to vacate Unit 412. She picked up her portfolio. That's everything. He signed 90 minutes later. She walked out of Brenda's building into a November afternoon that was cold and direct, and asked nothing of her that she had not already given. And she drove home in the 12-year-old Honda that she had always maintained with diligence and had never once felt the need to replace. And she parked in the driveway of the house on the south side of Atlanta that had been hers since before the marriage, and would be hers long after the memory of the marriage had softened into something that required no particular feeling to consider. She drove. 12 months later, Adize stood on the 4th-floor landing of the Peachtree Circle building in the early afternoon, reviewing a punch list for a renovation she had authorized for Unit 412 after the tenancy cleared. New hardwood floors throughout. A kitchen update. The bathroom tile replaced with the same terracotta salvage material she used in her own house because she had found the supplier reliable and the color honest. The work had taken 6 weeks, and she had overseen every phase herself, not because she needed to, but because she found that kind of attention satisfying. The physical knowledge that something had been done correctly because she had been present to confirm it. The building was fully occupied. All 14 units. The vacancy rate had been 0 for 8 months, which she tracked in the same quarterly summary she had always maintained. The holding company had acquired a second property in the Ormwood Park neighborhood in the spring, a 6-unit building she was currently in the process of renovating, which would bring her total portfolio to 20 units by the end of the following year. Her engineering practice had taken on 2 new municipal infrastructure contracts in the fall. The combined revenue of the practice and the holding company had crossed $890,000 in the previous fiscal year. She noted this in the quarterly summary with the same restraint she applied to everything, as a measurement of where the work had arrived and an indicator of where it was going. She had heard through a professional contact who moved in adjacent development circles that Curtis had left his project coordinator position after the divorce proceedings surfaced questions about his accounting practices on a development he had managed. He was working in residential sales now, a step down in most readings of that trajectory. Tanya Reeves had not moved into Unit 412. She had, according to the same contact, relocated to Marietta sometime in the fall. Curtis's mother had sent Adize a card at Christmas. It said nothing about Curtis, and everything about the kind of woman his mother had always privately believed Adize to be. Adize had written back with a brief, warm note and left it there. Miles Owusu, a structural engineer she had known professionally for 4 years, had asked her to dinner in September with the directness of someone who had thought about the question long enough to have an answer ready. He was a careful and thorough man who understood her work because it was adjacent to his own, and who had, on their second dinner, asked her about the Ormwood Park renovation with questions precise enough that she had found herself explaining the full project, load-bearing assessments and all, for 20 minutes without once feeling like she had said too much. That was new. She did not take it for granted. She pressed her hand against the newly finished door frame of Unit 412 and felt the solidity of the work, the tight fit of the casing, the level hang of the door. The particular pride of a thing built correctly by someone who understood what correct required. Her father had owned 3 properties and told no one. She had 20 units and would tell whoever asked, now that the people who had not been asking were gone. Freedom was the real currency. She had built everything worth keeping. And every joint in this building, every beam, every wall, held, because she had made sure of it herself. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.